Flathead. So I'd like everyone to welcome Dr. Paul Homer.
Thank you, Craig. That was a really interesting discussion about all that catch and release stuff. I've had a few dealings with a veterinary scientist who advises on some of this stuff around catch and release, and the thing he always says to me when you talk to anglers about this is, if you are catching and releasing, when you're handling that fish, think about if it was you, to anthropomorphise, you've just run an 800-metre race around a track, and now someone's holding your head in a bucket of water. That's what the fish is going through. So the key thing, like Bushy's saying, the barbless hooks is great. Just get them back in the water as quick as you can. That's where they want to be. So that's I'll leave it at that. So yeah, I'm Paul. I'm a scientist based in Queenscliff, and I do a lot of work on marine and estuarine species. I guess my main history of work has been in the larger bays on flathead, whiting, snapper. I'm now getting involved in dusky flathead, and I've been getting my head stuck into everything science about dusky flathead over the last few weeks, and so much so that a couple of nights ago I had a dream that my bathtub was full of dusky flathead, and I was trying to have a bath, worrying about getting spiked by them. So they're well and truly in my head today, and what I've done over the last few weeks is gone through a lot of the stuff that we might have done, but also a lot of the work on Duskies has been done up the east coast because they are found all up to Queensland. So people in New South Wales and Queensland, I've been on the phone talking to them and looking at their research. And also the people that have done work in Victoria. Jeremy Hindle done some tracking work in the lakes a few years ago. Tara Hicks, who recently done work on reproductive biology in Malakuta and Gippsland Lakes. And a young guy called Ruin Gannon. Some of you might know him. Used to live near Lake Tyers, mad keen dusky flathead fisherman. A lot of us scientists have evolved from being recreational fishers to studying the fish. It's often a good grounding, I suppose, and Ruin's one of those guys, and he's done a lot of work on the behaviour of duskies and their movement. So I'll touch on a bit of all this sort of work through my talk. I'm going to tell you most of what we do know, but there's still a lot we don't know about this species, and I'll also finish on some of that. Most of you probably know a bit about Duskies, or you're aware of them, but just a few quick facts. They are the largest flathead species that exist, so we're pretty lucky to have that in Australia. As Bushy said, being able to go out and catch an 80, 90 centimetre flathead in our estuaries is a privilege. They can live up to 16 years and reach about 15 kilos. In the old days, they might have had different names, and you'll read some of the historic documents. They're called black flathead or estuary flathead. I think even sometimes they might have been called mud flathead in the old days. There is difficulty sometimes in recognising a dusky for a few reasons. One is the coloration varies a lot depending on what habitat you're fishing in. So out on a sandy bottom, you might pull them up and they're quite pale like this. On a more seagrassy or rubbly bottom, they'll come up and they'll be a lot darker in colour. And as Kate, our manager, will talk about later, that provided a few issues with us in terms of setting up dusky-only management. So just a few people might not be aware of how to ID them. The key feature is this, the tail coloration. And duskies usually have dark pigments like this on the top of their tail fin. The other species, you can see a picture of it right here, mostly up here. They don't always look like a clear dot like that. You can often have variations of those dots, but they're always up on the top. Compared to a yank flathead, which is probably the most similar, where they have the same dark patches, but they're all down on the bottom of the tail fin. The other thing is the gill spines. Now, I don't want you getting too close to them because they are a bit dangerous, but on a dusky, they're equal in length. You'll see there's two. On a sand flathead, the bottom spine is roughly double the length of the top spine. But on a yank, they're the same as the dusky. So the key thing is the tail pigments, I suppose. Duskies are found all the way up the east coast of Australia, from sort of up into central North Queensland all the way down to Victoria. Victoria is at the end of the species range, but I think when we think about the climate change and the changes in this East Australian current and the warming water, we're looking pretty good in Victoria for a bit of an improvement in a few species that will float down the coast here and end up, not that I'm an advocate for climate change or anything, but if there is a beneficiary, it's probably going to be us. And recently there's been some unconfirmed reports of a few Duskies perhaps down around northeastern Tassie, but we haven't seen any photos yet. Now they're found in little estuaries and coves and bays all along the coast. At the moment, we have no idea how these different populations relate to each other in relation to, we know that you can find, and I'll show you some pictures later, that the earliest life stages of Duskies have been sampled out in coastal waters. So from some of these bigger estuaries that the entrances are always open, the little early life stages can be flushed out and drift with the currents, much like the prawns do down here to get into the estuaries, and potentially connect estuaries up and down the coast. So there may be subsidies of replenishment into this estuary, say from spawning in this one. The importance of that for these estuaries down here, we're not sure of, and I'll talk a bit more about that too later. Key feature of Dusky Flathead, which a few of you will know, but some of you won't, is the difference between males and females. This is a picture or a graph of the growth, or the average growth, of a male Dusky Flathead and a female in red. This is the age in years and the length. The way we work out the age of pretty much all fish these days is using their ear stones. Or the jewels you might know from the mulloway, etc. All fish have these in their head. We use them all the time in fisheries. So you dissect them out, you take a slice out of the bone under a microscope. See these dark bands like rings on trees? You just count them and there's one laid every year. That's how we age fish. Knowing the age of the fish, we can understand its longevity, and that tells us a lot about its vulnerability to fishing or what drives the population cycles. It tells us about the growth rate. We can relate the age to maturity to know how old and how big they are when they're mature, which is critical for how we set size limits and has informed the slot limit for Duskies as too. But the key feature here is you see that the males never go above 55. You'll hardly ever find a male above 55 centimetres. So everything over that slot pretty much will be a female. They're pretty similar in growth through till about 3, but from this point on the males slow down and the females just keep growing and accelerating past to get to the maximums. The other thing is the oldest males we've ever aged are only up to about 12 years, but females, the oldest, are about 16. So some people might think that big 80, 90 metre long flathead is 30, 40, 50 years, like a Murray cod, 60, 70 years, but these fish are actually quite short-lived. Snapper live to 30 or 40, for example, bream, the same. But these things are quite short-lived, and that has a really important implication for the way their populations vary in our estuaries over time. Move on to the next slide. So yeah, most of your females are only vulnerable because of this slot limit from the age of about 2 to 6 or 7. So half of their life at least, they're not vulnerable, provided you handle them and get them back quickly. Males are vulnerable for their whole life. I don't quite understand the implications of this in terms of sex ratios of the catches, etc., but something we might look into in the future. People also thought, oh, the males just change sex and become females, because some fish do that, and that's why you get this bias, but that's not true. They start off as females and males and they stay that way. The females grow faster and bigger. Maturity. So a lot of that work that's been done on these guys was around understanding their reproduction, and it was really around informing these regulations. You know, you want to protect fish a bit before they spawn. So working out the ages and sizes at maturity was a key thing. Pretty much most males, 30 odd centimetres, are right to go. They're mature. So they're growing really fast. In 2 years, these males are ready to participate in breeding. Females, there's a little bit of differences going on here. In New South Wales, studies that were done in the 2000s suggested that most of the females weren't fully mature until they were in the mid-50s, 4 or 5 years of age. The work just done recently by Tara Hicks' RFL project down here locally, she found that most of the females were mature when they were 33, much lower than up here. Now there may be some differences. The reason for this may be differences in the way the fish were sampled, like she sampled at the peak of spawning, this guy sampled throughout the year. But I guess the main thing to take out of all these studies, and in Queensland, is that once you're over 55, if you're a female Dusky, you're mature. They're all mature. Let's move on from that. I'm going to talk about reproduction, you know, the start of the life. This is where it all begins for a Dusky. This is my example system, lake tyres. Typical up the coast as well in New South Wales and our estuaries in Victoria, that what we see around sort of late spring coming into summer is a movement of fish from the upper reaches in the little rivers and anna branches down towards the entrance where they aggregate to spawn. We don't know a lot about the behaviour, the spawning interactions, how it works, but what we do see a lot of, and I was surprised how many photos I could find of this, pictures of big females with all these little males hanging around them. And we were talking about, Bushy was talking about eggs and egg quality and all that, and I'll talk a bit about that too, but the importance of being a big female in terms of attracting more males, we don't understand that. We don't understand that behaviour at all. We just know it is observed. But how these things reproduce is the female will probably swim up off the bottom and drop out all her eggs in the water column, and I imagine these little males then all just rush in and release their sperm, and it all mixes in the water and fertilises. So females being big might be an advantage in that you attract more males and you get more of your eggs fertilised. We don't know about that yet. So the spawning peak, found out by Tara in her studies a few years ago, November to January is typically the peak time when Dusky Flathead are spawning in our estuaries. So what does it look like? Bit of a gory photo, but we've got a mature female on the left, and you can see the size of these roe or egg sacs taking up most of the gut cavity. An immature one on the right, you know, very little, tiny, thin, glassy looking egg sacs. When the fish is spawning, and you'll see this in these 40, 50 centimetre films when cleaning them, to know that the fish is actually about to spawn, the appearance of these egg sacs will change from being just fairly consistently textured orangey colour, bit bloodshot. You'll start to see all these little mottled things. And these are what we call hydrated eggs. So these are eggs that this fish will release that day most likely. And behind these eggs there'll be a whole bunch of other ones in here that are in an earlier stage of development. And through the spawning season, the fish is maybe spawning every few days or multiple times, you know, many times over the spawning season, and it'll just release some of these, and the next lot will come through, it'll hydrate them up like this, and it'll release them again. So they're called batch spawners. So over that few months, each female will probably spawn. We don't know how many times, but quite a few. Bushy was also talking about egg quality, and some of the studies that have looked at this idea that big females, they produce heaps more eggs, but the idea that the eggs are better, they have more nutrition for the little larvae. The work that Tara did didn't seem to suggest that was the case with Duskies, but the key thing is that the big females just produce exponentially more eggs. And the other importance of the big females is that the things we don't know about, they're more experienced at spawning. You know, maybe they attract more males, which means they get more eggs fertilised. So there's still a whole lot we don't know about the importance of size in this species. So what you see here is the length of a female and the amount of eggs it's estimated to produce in one spawning season over those multiple spawnings. So a large female of a metre can deposit 4 million eggs in a spawning season. And as you get smaller, obviously exponentially less. And just to put it in perspective, an 80 centimetre female can produce 12 times as many eggs as a 35 centimetre female. There's still a lot of smaller, mid-sized fish in the fishery in terms of biomass, and they're all still really important for the spawning stock. That's why the bag limits are really important, because even though they're a 50 centimetre fish or 40, they're still contributing, and there's a lot of them, so they're still producing a lot of eggs overall. Early life. This is, in most fish species, this is the key part of the life cycle. If you get through this period, your chances of making it through to the juvenile stage and into the fishery are much higher. Most of those millions of eggs that a fish spawns every year, most of them die. 98% probably die in every year. a small change in the survival percentage, when you're talking about millions, adds up to thousands and thousands of more fish. So think about this life cycle I'm talking about, and subtle changes in the things that are influencing the survival of these can have big effects on the replenishment of our fish stocks. So the little eggs, sorry, skip forward. The little eggs float up into the water column. They hatch after a couple of days into these tiny little, what we call larvae, which have a little yolk sac, and they absorb that, then they start eating prey. They go through this developmental stages up in the water column, and when they get to about 10 millimetres after 20 or so days, they'll move down to the seabed to take up their bottom-dwelling life. We know very little about the ecology of this life stage for dusky flathead. There's a few samples being collected off the coast. No one's looked at what they eat or how old they are or whatever. It's a big gap. These guys, though, are depending on these tiny little prey. And Wayne was mentioning about the flooding of the plains and the draining of nutrients and plant material into the estuaries. All that stuff breaks down and feeds the food chain. And the food chain starts with these tiny little things called, little copepods and microscopic crustaceans, which these little larvae eat. And these little larvae, as they grow, their mouth is smaller and then it gets bigger and bigger. When they're really small, they can only eat certain sizes. So you need a range of these sizes in different life stages of prey for these guys to get through that life stage. It's very vulnerable, and we know from the snapper and other species that some years we can have heaps of eggs being deposited, really good spawning biomass. We go out and we find there's none of these life stages because the food, this plankton, wasn't productive. And that comes back to the environmental drivers, the nutrients, the river flow, all that kind of stuff. They get through here, they'll settle down and become a little juvenile. And, you think they had it hard here, now they're going down onto the bottom where there's a whole bunch of other mouths trying to eat them, including perhaps their parents and relatives, I suppose. So this is the time when most of them die, and getting through that's quite a challenge for them. So the environmental processes are really key. Currents and turbulence, which determine whether these things get drifted way out into the Tasman Sea and never come back to an estuary and just die, whether they make it into an estuary, the nutrients which supply the food chain, the microscopic plants that these things depend on, light, temperature, salinity, all those factors come into the play for these little guys to get through. The other really interesting thing, Wayne was talking about it, entrances. A lot of the estuaries in New South Wales are permanently open. Ours are open and closed intermittently. These things are down here in the entrance laying their eggs. If there's a big opening in summer, there's a fair chance a lot of those propagules and larvae will get flushed out on a tide, and they might typically head this way. They might end up coming into Lake's entrance and settling in there. When it's closed, they'll all be entrained. We don't know the implications of opening and closing at different times around when these fish are spawning for how many of these we get surviving and ending up back in the populations. So that's an area that I think we could look at a lot more into the future and basically get a better understanding of things like unnatural openings and how they might affect a species like Duskies as well as many of the other species that live in these and spawn in these estuaries. Habitat. I won't dwell on habitat too long. The key thing about habitat is it's not just structure and shelter somewhere for fish to live. You can see here, this little juvenile guy here, he's hiding into the seagrass, trying to look camouflage. I think this is a picture of a little one caught on a lure. I don't think he's just put it on his hand, but they're pretty voracious from a young age, and they're chasing small fish like gobies and small prawns, etc., that live around these seagrass beds. We've found little fish under 10 centimetres, usually in seagrassy, sort of sheltered, muddy backwater areas. The central regions in Malakuta. I found them all through lakes. Jones Bay was an area one of our surveys has caught them, but I've also caught little tiny ones in the seagrass beds around Meetung. They're typically like the more sheltered areas. The big fish are, they're not so worried. They're like the top predators in these estuaries, and they'll be pretty much using all the range of habitats. They'll go right up to the fresh water almost in the winter time. So they're pretty much happy to just hide out in open sand, and wait to ambush prey. What I mean about not only shelter, but also food, back against what you said, Wayne, a lot of these plant materials are the food of the food chain that these things feed on. So your prawns and your crabs and your shrimps are all grazing on these seagrass beds, or the detritus, the dead leaves that break off. That all is food into those smaller critters that are eaten by other fish that end up being eaten by the big Duskies. So the habitat, the plants in the estuaries are absolutely critical for both the structure and the shelter and the food supply. And also salt marshes and things like that that are on the shorelines, as they get flooded too and they break down, they also supply nutrient to the system. And studies in New South Wales have found that there's a linkage between salt marsh nutrients and prey in the estuaries. They can test this through chemical analysis. So even habitats that are not in the estuary itself can be important for Duskies. Food. We all know what they like. They like pretty much things that we like. Fresh fish, shrimps, prawns and crabs. Once they get older, they're pretty much going for the mobile prey more and chasing fish and things like that. They'll eat other things like octopus and even cannibalise their little ones. There's an interesting story about Bushy, of that fish being caught. And of course, they love these. That's probably one of their favourite foods, but we all know that. So there's been a fair bit of work done on movement behaviour, and there's like two scales of movement. One is sort of broader scale between estuaries and within the range within estuaries, and others is really local home range stuff, and I'm going to talk a little bit about both. Back in the 2000s, we had a program called VicTag. Some of you might have been involved in it, where using traditional tagging, tag and release to learn about sort of broad scale fish movement. A lot of the data in this program is still sitting, hasn't been looked at. So I sourced it out and I grabbed out all the VicTag data on Dusky Flathead, and I was amazed to see that 5,700 Duskies were tagged over about a 5-year period, this was a really good period for Dusky Flathead, as you'll see in one of the later talks. These two guys here, Peter Spear, who's unfortunately not with us, who was an amazing Dusky Flathead fisherman and a great contributor to our diary angler program, tagged over 3,000 flathead himself in that period, lake ties, Malakuta mostly. So, and another guy, Brett Geddes, who you might know is a fishing writer, he's tagged 1,300. So these two guys tagged most of them, just between the two of them. We actually had 650 recaptures, which is quite a good number. But the amazing thing, and the most key finding out of this, was that of all those recaptures, only 3 of them were caught outside of the estuary that they were actually tagged in. And this is consistent with New South Wales, that very few of these fish actually move out of the estuary. Once they settle in there and take up home, that's where they stay pretty much for the rest of their life. One went from lake ties to the North Arm in Gippy Lakes after 1,600 odd days. Another one swam from Malakuta to Lake Tyers, recaptured after 170 days. So local residents. That's old school tagging. The new school tags, old school's still great and we should still keep doing that for certain questions, but we can now use electronic tags. See, this little thing here looks like a little bullet that we catch the fish, we anaesthetise it. While it's knocked out, we keep flowing water over its gills, etc., to keep it oxygenated. Do a little surgery, put this tag inside, stitch the fish up, release it, and we deploy these things out in the water. These are listening stations, and these little devices will detect the sound signals, ultrasonic signals that these tags transmit, and it will recognise the individual tag, so you'll know which fish was there at a particular time, and it records the time and date. So you can work out the timings of movement and broad extents. And this was a study done in the 2000s in Gippsland Lakes. Jeremy Hindle, and he had a lot of help from the Nicholson Angling Club and guys like Brett Geddes and that tagging the fish. Just quickly, a couple of different types of movement. Holland's Landing area, this fish was tagged over about 8 or 10 months. It swam the whole sort of system. And it was found down here in that spawning period. So that was quite a large movement, but the majority of them tended to stay pretty local, moving on the scale of, say, 10 kilometres. And a lot of them were sort of up in the rivers in the winter time. I won't say much more about that. The other scale of movement is home range. So over a shorter time period, you go out and you catch a big flatty and you release it. Is it stay in that area, or is it going to swim somewhere else? How long has it been in that area for in the past? So this guy, young guy Ruin, using these same tags, but a system where you can go out in a boat and put a little hydrophone thing over the side, and you can just go around and find your fish, and then you can just follow it around. And this scientist did this, and he went out a number of times over a winter, and he'd follow these individual fish around for 70 odd hours, just following them. You know, listen, oh, it's over there, go over here, and plotting all their positions over that time period. And so for smaller fish, their home ranges, and this is in New South Wales in the St George's River, which runs into Botany Bay. Typically only about 3 hectares these fish were sort of hanging in that area, and that was their sort of home range. That was enough for them to get enough food, etc., for that smaller range. But he found as he tracked larger and larger fishes, this is probably pretty intuitive, the home ranges grew. They obviously moved around and needed to find more food or something. They needed a bigger resource base. But they often also had multiple home ranges, so they would move from one area to another. They can move pretty quickly. He was tracking one fish one day and he lost it, and he looked over in the distances, probably about 500 or 600 metres away, and there was a bunch of birds feeding on some bait. And being a fisherman himself, he thought, oh, I wonder if that's where my fish has gone. So he drove over, and sure enough, that's where his Dusky was. It had found that prey and moved 600, 800 metres in a matter of minutes. So they can move if they want to. And just getting towards the end, actually now, the other way you can track fish with these new age tags is what's called an accelerometer tag. And this is a tag that actually detects fish movement activity. So it detects bursts, and it detects things like, you can use it to measure feeding activity. When is the fish most active? And this is an example which is fairly typical of a number of fish he did this with, of their activity cycles, and this is over 5 days. These peaks and troughs, this black graph here, is the pattern of activity. So the higher the peak, the more active that fish is over the 5-day period. You can see the midnights here. What you guys will be interested in, I suppose, when was this fish most active? And it's mostly when it's feeding. And I'll show you when. So this is not probably, probably a lot of you know this, but it's interesting to see it, science actually going out and measuring this type of thing. These peaks here, the yellow and reds, are the dawn and dusks. So early morning, late afternoon, evening. And you can see that there's always little peaks in activity that relate to those periods, but generally the dawn peaks are higher than the dusk peaks. Yeah, so they're probably a little bit more active and a bit more hungry in the dawn. During the middle of the night, they're not doing much at all. These ones here, though, the really big ones, are really interesting, and these relate to tidal cycles. And bear in mind, this is a tidal estuary. Lake Tyers, when it's closed, is not tidal. I'm not sure if these results relate to those systems or perhaps way up in the lakes, but what he found was slack water, low tide. So the bottom of the low tide, perhaps when all the prey are pulled up and things, these fish really turned on. And being a fisherman himself, he could swear by it. If he was fishing in these systems, if he wanted to collect fish for his tagging project, he would always look for the slack water, low tides. Doesn't matter during the day, and that's when he'd go out and target his fish and get his best catches. So his motto was, slack on the low is the way to go for Duskies in tidal estuaries. So I'll be interested to know if other people have other theories about tidal influences and things on catch and feeding activity of Duskies. So just a few key points out of that to wind up. Pretty much apart from that potential exchange of larvae, our estuaries are largely localised populations, and we can sort of look at them from a fisheries assessment way as a sort of almost local stocks. Those early life stages, as we've said, are vulnerable. They're the most vulnerable stage, and the variation in the survival of those is a key player in driving the dynamics of these populations in our estuaries. So all these environmental factors come into play here, and we don't know the full story about that at this stage. The other thing is that most Duskies probably don't live past 10, although the maximum age is 16. It's like humans, most of us don't make the maximum age, fish are the same, so maybe around 10 is a kind of an average lifespan for a Dusky. The combination of relatively short life with highly variability in the survival of these little ones means that we get a lot of fluctuations in our Dusky flathead populations in our estuaries. So if you fish for Duskies for a long period of time in your local estuary, you probably know that there's been good and bad times, and they come and go. So this is an example of this. This is Dusky flathead commercial fishery production in Gippsland Lakes and Malakuta over 100 years. And when I put this graph up, I saw these sort of almost decadal cycles, high variability in the production of these fisheries over time. So thank you very much for listening, and I'll just make the last point. If there's an area from all my reviewing of the literature and talking to the scientists up the coast, etc., the thing that we know least about in terms of the biology and ecology of these Duskies is these stages, the early life, what sort of environmental conditions they need to survive and prosper, their habitats, pretty much everything. If we can do a bit more on that, that would be really important for us going forward. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Paul. Probably really set us up for the next sessions. Probably time for one or two questions before we go for morning tea. If there's anything, a really very interesting presentation. So has that sparked yes up the back?
Why do we not have a closed season on these fish over their spawning season? With the research going into these fish, I don't know whether there's thought that maybe the species is a bit vulnerable.
Look, I think the vulnerability around these is more the environment and the habitat. Like that's the key driver of those big fluctuations. It's things that, as I said, with snapper and other species, we can have huge amounts of spawning stock out there. And one year we go out and we do surveys of the babies of these and we get nothing. The next year, same amount of spawning stock, we get thousands. So I think understanding those environmental drivers to me, is more critical than to close in the spawning season, because we've got pretty good regulations on them now anyway. I suppose the one uncertainty is that, is there this sort of complex behavioural thing going on between males and females, and if you pull a big female out who was aggregating with a few males around it, does that affect what goes on after that? So that's just a bit of a thing we don't know much about how important that is. So yeah, I tend to think the environment and habitat's the first priority. Yep.
Okay, well, looks like we'll break for a morning tea, which is up the back.